London, 18th century. Close your eyes and it is not romance you hear first. It is friction, wagon wheels grinding over stone, hawkers calling through the damp air, church bells cutting time into the streets. And beneath it all, a heavier sound, like a city breathing through its teeth. Here is the opening question. How does a place become the nerve center of the world, while so many of its people live one bad week away from ruin? This was a city of extremes. By the early 1700s, London had swollen into a metropolis of more than 500,000 souls. That number matters because it changes everything. When a city grows that fast, it does not simply get bigger. It gets louder, sharper, more dangerous, and strangely, more modern. In the same hour, you could watch a silk-coated gentleman step down from a polished carriage in the West End, and then, only a short ride away, watch a child pick through gutter mud for anything that could be traded for a meal. London held both scenes without blinking. It was building an empire and struggling to keep its own streets from swallowing it. Now imagine we have a key to the past, but not a fantasy key. A real one. Paper, ink, and pigment. Thousands of engravings, paintings, and street views made by people who stood where we stand, who looked up at the same skyline, who watched the same river traffic and the same crowds. These images are not just art. They are evidence. And if you treat them like evidence, you can do something thrilling. You can reconstruct a city that no longer exists in the form it once had. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. But closely enough to feel the shape of daily life. The width of a street, the height of a roofline, the density of a crowd, the way smoke softens the edges of buildings, the way the river reflects a cold, grey sky. So in this documentary, we are going to walk into those images. We will use them like windows, and we will move through London the way an 18th century Londoner would, by following the flow of power. Because power in Georgian London had two highways. One was the river, the other was money. Everything else, fashion, politics, science, crime, even architecture, gathered around those currents like iron filings around a magnet. That is why the Thames is crowded. Not because it is picturesque, but because it is the bloodstream of an empire being assembled piece by piece. Now bring the camera lower, just enough to feel the crush. On the river, there is no empty space. Oars slap the surface. Water knocks against hulls with a steady, impatient rhythm. A sailor shouts to a dockhand who cannot hear him over the groan of timber, clatter of crates. Somewhere a gull screams, sharp as a knife. And under it all, the slow drag of the tide reminds you that the Thames does not belong to London. London depends on it, but the river is older, stronger, indifferent. Along the banks, the city looks like it has grown teeth. Wharves jut into the water. Warehouses stand shoulder to shoulder, their windows small, their doors wide, built to swallow cargo. Cranes swing slowly like long-necked birds. Men bend and straighten in endless repetition. Their coats are stained with grease and river water. Their hands are split. Their work is loud, physical, and constant, because everything London consumes must first pass through someone's arms. Here is the detail people often miss. Prosperity had a smell. It smelled like wet wood, coal smoke, animal hide, and the sour tang of the river at low tide. It was not clean. It was not elegant. It was tangible and it clung to your clothes. And this is where the next effect begins to emerge. When a city becomes the place where the world arrives, the city must adapt its shape. Docks expand, storage expands, accounting expands, insurance expands. The institutions that will later define London's global power are not abstract ideas at first. They are responses to a practical problem. Too much movement, too much value, too much risk, all pressing through a narrow corridor of water. That risk is visible right here. A spark in a warehouse, a rope, and decided to rebuild bigger. In the next chapter, we go closer. We leave the restless water and step onto the streets that were reshaped by disaster and determination. We will look up at the building that became a symbol of London's confidence. and we will see how a single skyline can be an argument. Because once you understand what London chose to put at its center, you understand what London believed it was becoming. The dome rises through the smoke like a decision. From the river it looks calm, almost untouched by the noise below. But the closer you get, the more you realize it is not calm at all. It is a statement, pressed into the skyline with stone and patience. A city does not build something like this by accident. It builds it when it wants to be seen, when it wants to be believed, when it wants to convince itself that it has outgrown fear. But that would miss what St. Paul's really does. St. Paul's is not only a church, it is a piece of urban psychology. It makes London look orderly, even when London is not orderly. It makes the skyline feel intentional, and that feeling has consequences. People invest in a city that looks confident. Foreign merchants trust a city that seems stable. Politicians push their vision harder when the capital itself appears monumental. The building becomes a kind of silent partner in every transaction taking place beneath it. Look again at how it sits over the city. Around it, rooftops are uneven. Chimneys punch up like jagged teeth. The streets below are dense and alive. And still, the dome holds its shape. It gathers the chaos into a frame. Now cut to a different detail, closer to the ground, and you find another structure that exists for a different reason. The monument. It stands as memory made physical, a tall finger pointing upward as if accusing the sky. The city could have chosen to forget. It could have paved over the scar and moved forward. Instead, it chose to keep a reminder in plain view. That choice matters, because a city that remembers disaster builds differently. It argues with itself. It fears certain materials. It writes laws. It reshapes habits. And the monument does something else. It turns tragedy into identity. Visitors come to stare at it. Writers describe it. Artists place it in the background. Over time, the fire becomes part of the story. London tells about its own resilience. Resilience is a currency too. Now let us widen out and listen to the street again, because the cathedral's power is not just visual, it is social. You are standing in a city where belief and commerce share the same air. The bell that calls people to worship also marks time for business. The church is both spiritual and public. When the city gathers, it gathers under this dome, but not always for prayer. It gathers for funerals that become political theatre, for ceremonies that display hierarchy, for moments when London needs to see itself as a single organism instead of a million private struggles. Those struggles are close, very close. Take 3 steps away from the grandeur, and you see the other London. A boy carrying a load too heavy for his frame. A woman selling cheap ribbons, her fingers red with cold. A clerk moving fast, eyes down, protecting his pockets. A porter spitting into the gutter, a thin dog weaving between legs. The cathedral does not erase hardship. It sits above it like a crown.